Listen-only mode.
Good afternoon or good morning, and welcome to Kirton McConkie's fourth webinar in our four-part series on how to build your gigabit network, resources available for cities. We're really pleased to have you again at this webinar. This is our fourth and final one, although we will continue to speak to these issues and talk a little bit about some upcoming events at the end of the webinar that you can learn more about this important subject. My name is Drew Clark. I'm of Counsel at Kirton McConkie. I'm joined by David Shaw, shareholder at Kirton McConkie, and David will kick us off with a brief discussion of resources available to cities before we turn to our panel that includes Lev Gonick, Chief Executive of One Community, Adam Eisner, Director of Networks at Ting, and Steve Johnson, Principal and Founder of SJ Advisors. But let's first turn to David Shaw. Tell us a little bit about our topic here for today's webinar.
Great. Thank you, Drew, and welcome back again. We're delighted to have you all with us. We've got a great panel lined up. And so, with no further ado, let me jump into the topic, resources available to cities. It sounds sort of like a topic that may not have a lot of excitement to it until you dive into the details. And as we dive in today, I guarantee there's lots of excitement around this topic. But I'd like you to start with thinking about your project. Let's go to the next slide. And think of it in terms of your team. And who is it that really makes up the team of a successful project as you build your gigabit network? And this is irrespective of whether you build it yourself, whether you're wholesale, whether you're dark fiber, whether you're retail, whether you're in a public-private partnership. These are the sorts of teams that you need to be successful. We've talked about a lot of pillars of success in the past, but we haven't really talked about what is the cohesive team. And you'll hear today from some of the members of some of these teams, but not all. We don't have time. But I would suggest that oftentimes projects get very much bogged down in one or two of these topic areas, but don't focus on the entire team necessary. And there are others as well that you'll find fit your particular circumstance. So in order to be successful, you need not just a technology team. Technology is important. Not just a construction team. That's important. But neither one of those matter if you don't have your finance team. And we'll hear from Steve Johnson in a little bit. None of it matters if you don't have your management team, which I don't even have up here and have neglected to do so. And we'll hear from Lev and from Adam to that effect. You need your legal team. You need your engineering team, your suppliers, your vendors. What's your public relations strategy? And you'll see as you go into the case studies that there have been a variety of successes with each of these areas. And what I would submit to you is that if you are weak in one or more of these, those are the areas you really need to focus on. Now, we've talked in the past about the need to be able to finance a project, to have the legality of the project. We'll hear today about what do you do with the project once it's up and running. And so we're looking forward to an excellent panel today. And as our panelists dive in, I would encourage you just to think about that backdrop. One other thing I would mention, perhaps in just a brief closing on my remarks, is that if you take this microcosm of the team and effectively blow it up into a greater universe, you then have the other resources available, whether that's at your state level, at the federal level, whether it's in the private sector. Who are the drivers in your community, for example? Do you have the Chamber of Commerce on board? Do you have the Rotarians on board? Do you have the Lady Lions Club on board? You get the gist. And what about your schools? Do they support the project? What about the hospital? What about the fire chief and the police chief? And so as you expand that universe into a microcosm of success, that is what will help you build your gigabit network to the maximum extent possible. And so, Drew, with that, I'll turn it back to you to introduce our panelists.
Great. Well, thank you very much for laying that picture out. Do we still have that one last slide with the tombstones? Just also wanted to highlight, building on David's remarks about the things you need in your team. We at Kirton McConkie have worked closely with a number of cities and projects that are working towards and building gigabit networks, and we're very excited again for the programs and the applications that we're going to hear now. So we will now turn to Lev Gonik. Lev is, as I mentioned, Chief Executive of One Community, a nonprofit gigabit network in northeastern Ohio. Lev, let's turn it over to you now.
Thanks very much, Drew, and thanks everybody for joining us. I'd like to begin by giving you a preview of the conclusion of my remarks so that while I have your attention for the first minute or so, you'll know how to end up. And I'm going to build right on David's previous slide, because after 10 years in building out one of the nation's largest public benefit networks, I want to add two bubbles to his very important set of ecosystem development. One is actually critically important, which is that in addition to, not instead of, but in addition to having a technical infrastructure that you're working on, that you're developing through all the mechanisms that he has outlined and in previous sessions you've had a chance to explore, there is also, from our experience, a need, indeed a deep need, to connect your technology infrastructure to the programmatic priorities of the communities within which you operate. And I'll be speaking specifically to those activities in just a moment. The other piece that I think will be of interest to everyone who's involved in this particular webinar will be that you have an advantage, almost undoubtedly, over all of the national and international incumbent players in this space. And that is the intimacy of your relationship and the customer relationship opportunity that you have. And I think those two bubbles, again, programmatic bubbles, and really figuring out kind of your core value in terms of your community presence and your relationship to your prospective subscribers and anchor institutions is hugely important. So for those of you who don't know anything about Northeast Ohio, this is really just Cleveland is on Lake Erie. Cuyahoga County is our county. One Community started off literally 10 years ago as a project connecting two institutions, and today, we can go to the next slide, we actually connect over 2,400 route miles of fiber. We've put in $100 million worth of infrastructure, connecting over 2,600 community institutions, organizations, from primarily in healthcare, education, government, but also museums and libraries. And indeed, we have over a dozen data centers in Northeast Ohio. We provide both dark and lit services for data center, as well as also providing lit services and/or dark services to a number of commercial carriers. Interestingly enough, One Community, it is a nonprofit organization, actually has a wholly owned for-profit subsidiary that actually delivers services to the commercial sector here in Northeast Ohio. And like a lot of other projects, in fact all projects funded through federal stimulus funds, we are an open internet provider. We've also taken a very forward stand on net neutrality as well. And as I've already mentioned, very much focusing in on our build-out as a platform for collaboration and programmatic innovation along the way. Next slide. I just want to spend a couple of minutes that I have in these preliminary outlining some of the programmatic initiatives and tying it directly back into the actual build-out of the network. Again, a kind of pragmatic approach to building out hand-in-hand the network with attending to the priorities of our community. And so we actually, this past year, announced a Big Gig Challenge to our public sector prospective customers. These are people in government, economic development typically, partnering with their own constituents to develop their own digital strategies for their communities. In Northeast Ohio, there are over 600 jurisdictional organizations, cities, villages, municipalities, and the like. And we've spent many years trying to engage, educate, and try to actually work with them. This year, we actually decided to reverse the process by putting out a challenge. We put up to $2 million of our own capital into play, and then asked the cities and communities around Northeast Ohio to actually bid on the opportunity to partner. We touched almost all of the counties in Northeast Ohio, about 20 of the 24, and really were overwhelmed with the positive response along the way. This allowed us, again, our formula here was that we would provide the first 25 cents of every dollar invested in the overall project. This again led to over 24 submissions. We ultimately selected 4. We'll go to the next slide, which really afforded us a chance to both partner in support of our public mission of delivering network services for public good and public value, but also afforded us a chance to work with these 4 communities to actually see them make their own investments to extend our network deeper into their own communities. And really, I think this has proven to be extremely important activity for us as we look to extend the network build in a, we think, fairly creative and collaborative fashion. We can go to the next slide. I'll just also share with you that one of the things that we have begun to do deeper into the community is we've actually begun to deploy a number of fiber hoods. These are really residential programs trying to take the really ground zero of the foreclosure crisis in America was right here in Northeast Ohio, and begin to participate in the redevelopment programs that are going on, both for accelerators and incubators like in Shaker Heights, but also directly into MDUs, apartments, multiple dwelling units, where we are providing gigabit or 100 megabit services plus an entertainment package at prices that, again, we thought would be disruptive, and we've been very pleased with the uptake everywhere we go. This service also allows us to build more fiber and to begin to develop a new service line in collaboration with our cities, but also with our private developers who are looking to create a differentiated product. And we'll go to the next slide. I'll just share with you another project that we've been working on. Significant. We've made an announcement here in Northeast Ohio that we've launched a 100 gig network for our health, technology, and education community. We are working in a significant way to extend our network in our own schools here in Northeast Ohio, partnering to create collaborative learning environments not only with our schools, but again with a number of our other subscribers. Specifically, for example, the Cleveland Clinic and University Hospitals are now delivering health and wellness education directly into schools interactively, from surgical suites and or from medical doctors' offices interactively with students from literally 6th through 12th grade. The Cleveland Institute of Music and the Cleveland Orchestra are participating in music education into the schools. We also have restaurant tours and community farm-to-table projects delivering STEM education directly into our schools. Again, an opportunity to both drive business and attend to community priorities in education. Last slide or so here. We've actually announced a partnership with the City of Cleveland and a whole host of other folks that you can see in the slide here, which really is a partnership for economic development, taking a corridor or a zone for innovation. We call ours the Health Tech Corridor here, which if you go to the next slide, it sort of just kind of gives you a little bit of a relief of the 3.5 miles here, in which we've connected 17 developers and the City of Cleveland between downtown Cleveland and University Circle with 100 gig network infrastructure as an attractor for never before seen innovation in health, in video production, and in 3D modeling, again mostly for health related activities. and connected it to our medical mart, our convention center here as well. And again, a valuable way of connecting our agenda of building networks directly into the actual physical properties. And the very last slide really just kind of gives you a summary of that health tech corridor project. Really, it was just showcased yesterday in the Philly online magazine called Next City. You're welcome to take a peek at it if you're at all interested. But again, it speaks fundamentally to my takeaway lesson here, which is design, build, and operate your network well architected, financed properly, but connected to the things that bring you value add, the community priorities, which you know better than just about anybody, in fact, indeed better than anybody, and make sure you take advantage of your relationships directly to the other leading thought organizations in your community. I'll pass it back to you, Drew.
Thanks. Just one quick question, Lev, on the diagram. When you had the map of the city and the points, could you just speak to what the points are representing? What have you been able to engage through your collaborative efforts in each of these locations in Cleveland?
Right. Again, this is kind of the micro. This is literally the city street. The next slide sort of speaks to the actual strategies. These were the actual co-applicants for a 100 gig network submission. This really speaks to one of the funding strategies. This was not our investment directly. The City of Cleveland's Economic Development Organization put in a chunk of change. We put in a chunk of change, and together, along with Case Western Reserve University and our PBS station here in town, wrote a grant to the EDA for commercial access to the nation's, the first commercially available 100 gig ready network for commercial development. And so each of those earlier dots or these flags that you see in this version are really the 17 development plots along our health tech corridor, which are connected to our fiber optic infrastructure, for which now developers, the city, actually an organization called the Health Tech Corridor Development Authority, run by Jeff Epstein here in town, is literally now making it possible for folks to begin to locate themselves on this corridor. And as tenants move in from either other parts of Northeast Ohio or from out of region, we make available network access of up to 100 gigs.
Well, thank you for explaining this, Lev. And of course, you're one of the oldest of these gigabit networks with super capacity. Could you just speak, though, to those that have built out the middle mile strategy the way you have here? How, I mean, do you offer to residential? I mean, is that at all in the plan? What would you say to people in your shoes who have built this great capacity for the anchor institutions, the healthcare, the educational, the government institutions? Do you see yourself kind of venturing into that space at all, or what advice would you give to others considering that?
Right. Drew, I would simply begin by sharing that each participant in this webinar series needs to think of their own particular local circumstance. We have been building out, again, about $100 million worth of investment all across a fairly wide swath of the northern third of Ohio, really to connect mostly our community anchor institutions, along with, as we've shared, many other adjacent facilities. So our fiberhood strategy really builds on our connections to a number of healthcare and libraries that dot the entire region, and then offering some connectivity to accelerators, and really our very first forays into some residential, although in our case very specifically targeted to MDUs, to apartments where there's density. So I don't actually have a prescription for everybody. Again, the biggest value to our Kirton McConkie is really helping each individual community develop a strategy, a technical and a financial and legal framework that actually works for them. I would simply say that while we read a lot of press releases about gig to the front porch in cities across America, we are really just at the very bottom of the first inning in doing that activity. The best projects that I think we will actually see moving will not be necessarily the ones grabbing the headlines, and I think folks will probably know many of those cities. I think it'll actually be smaller cities, cities that, for example, my colleague who's just about, I think, to speak from Ting, who really can sort of speak to trying to create a value proposition that really is meaningful and contextually relevant.
Great. Excellent segue for our next speaker. We're really pleased that Adam Eisner, Director of Networks for Ting, will speak to us now and tell us a little about the exciting things you're doing in Charlottesville and Westminster.
Great. Thanks. Really excited to be here. Really have been really looking forward to this. And what I'm hopefully going to do is give everybody some food for thought as you're thinking about the team members and the resources and things that you require to put together your gigabit network, that I can give you a few things you might want to consider from a service provider's point of view and what we're going through at Ting and sort of how we view the gigabit universe as we get involved. So next slide, please. So I'm just going to spend a quick second talking a little bit about Ting because you may not have heard of us. We're a fairly new entrant in the gigabit fiber space. You may have heard about our parent company, which is Two Cows. If you were on the internet in the 90s, may have downloaded some shareware or something similar from us. We are one of the oldest internet companies out there. We actually established a mobile brand in 2012 named Ting, which currently has about 150,000 active devices on it. It's a mobile service provider in the U.S. And now, as of late last year, we're branching out that business into fiber-to-the-home services. Next slide, please. So the whole idea of Ting is really based on the notion that people don't enjoy the relationship that they have with their existing service providers. This is especially true in the U.S. Mobile phone market, where I'm sure we've all had a frustrating experience where we have talked to one of the incumbent service providers and either wasted many hours of our lives or had to pay exorbitant sums of money to rectify something, or maybe both, that really just sort of left a bad taste in your mouth. And so just by really being human and applying very customer-friendly principles like no-hold technical support, fair pricing, a transparent approach to our business, we've been able to really take off in the U.S. Next slide, please. So much so that Consumer Reports study in the late end of last year came out and gave Ting one of the highest survey scores ever achieved for a U.S. mobile phone provider. And really this was just based on being human, being a company that a customer would be happy to call and enjoy their experience with. And we've really sort of built on that notion and channeled that frustration in getting into the fiber to the home space, where we feel like people have similar sort of relationships and experiences with incumbent cable and internet providers. And so really what we're trying to do is just bring the same sort of approach we had in mobile to fiber. Next slide, please. And so you may have, as Lev referred to previously, we're getting into two markets right now. One is Charlottesville, Virginia, and one is Westminster, Maryland. So in Charlottesville, Virginia, we have acquired a fiber to the home provider called Blue Ridge Internetworks, and in Westminster, Maryland, we have entered into an agreement with the city to be a network operator and service provider using a network that the city is currently building themselves. And so I am guessing for the purposes of this presentation, the latter is probably of a bit more interest, and I'll be talking specifically about Westminster in a couple of slides. Next slide, please. So I wanted to take a second to talk about, when we're looking at different municipalities, what makes it attractive as a service provider. In my job, I am talking to a lot of different companies and municipalities about potential networks that Ting Internet could hypothetically get involved in the future. And I've really boiled it down to a couple of slides here that I think are very pertinent. First and foremost, I say everything Joanne Hovis says. Joanne is, I believe, the principal at a company called CTC, and what I've listed there is a Google Fiber blog entry you've probably all seen. And in it, that entry links to a report titled Gigabit Communities that her company wrote, which talks a lot about technical strategies for facilitating construction in a municipality when it comes to building a gigabit fiber network, and friendly policies toward construction and permitting, and et cetera, et cetera. All of which is surely a webinar in itself, but what I really just wanted to call out there was there's a lot of things that report touches on that are used by a lot of companies, including Google, to prescribe to municipalities approaches that are friendly in getting construction done and implementing policies that are attractive to service providers. So, rather than rehash that whole report, I would say definitely take a look. One thing that we also look at when we're looking at markets that are hypothetically attractive is ones that are relatively underserved by competitors. So I think a lot of people in this audience today represent markets where there aren't 4 or 5 big companies providing internet services, because otherwise there'd probably be a slightly better level of satisfaction than what you're probably experiencing relative when it comes to internet service quality. Another thing we really look to is predictable roles around what are municipalities expecting regarding build, installation, and equipment responsibilities. So this is not always as well thought out when we're talking to municipalities as one might think. So who is responsible for installation to what part of a premises, using what equipment, and what responsibilities are required of a network operator and service provider relative to what a municipality actually wants to take on. This varies with every municipality that we talk to, and there generally is no right answer, although I'll talk a bit about what is more attractive to us specifically, that I think would probably reflect what most service providers are looking at. But just to have that story straight is a very important thing that not everybody always has together. And then finally on this slide I mentioned a realistic view of the business landscape and challenges. And so what I really mean by that is a general sort of approach to being flexible, to not having all policies at the outset exactly set in stone before talking to service providers and learning of their business challenges. And maybe most importantly, for a lot of municipal networks that are going to look to service providers to partner with, to just realize that they don't appear out of the woodwork. So, we have spoken to more than one municipality that has expected that once a network is completed, that suddenly a bunch of companies will come clamoring to sell. And that's not always necessarily the case. So you definitely want to think about sowing those seeds early, certainly well before a network is completed. Next slide, please. So a few other quick questions that I'll throw out here. Like I just said, it's never too early to start thinking about talking to providers, because lead time for a lot of service providers is in the months to years. So certainly if you're 6 to 12 months out from setting up a network, you'll want to talk to service providers for sure. The upfront investment and what's going to be required there, so that sort of speaks back to how much a municipality is interested in taking on as it pertains to construction and things beyond constructing the middle mile. Again, there is no right answer, but the more you are thinking about downloading to a service provider, the more a service provider has to consider in terms of expenses. And in conjunction with that, a service provider is going to want to know when they can expect to recoup that investment. And then in all of that, what is the risk? So a lot of municipalities will be looking at issuing bonds and servicing some form of debt in order to get this up and running. And a lot of municipalities, rightly so, think about partnering with different service providers or companies to possibly help address that. But you got to make sure that whatever you're looking at doesn't place all of the risk on a service provider, because most providers are not going to be interested in shouldering that entire responsibility. When a municipality and a service provider work together and share some of that load, you find that they both are working in the right direction to, making sure the right objectives are achieved and in the right way. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to throw this out here from a service provider's point of view. This is a great graphic that the team at Blue Ridge Internetworks did that I stole basically and added some Ting Blue to. And this is basically all the different considerations that certainly us and I would think most service providers have to think of when we're setting up a gigabit network. So this is just to give you an idea of the things that a provider is thinking about, so therefore things you might want to consider when you're developing your strategy and thinking about what resources you need and what you're planning to finance. So this starts, all the way on the left with what backhaul and network providers are actually available in and around your municipality, and how a service provider might get in touch with those and what pricing arrangements might be, straight through to field equipment and splicing and what level of that is going to be required in your network as a service provider or network operator, and then what OLTs, equipment, and other such things that are going to be used to light the network are required, and who is going to have to purchase those and who is responsible for installing, etc. Stuff that is important to start thinking about now, I think, as you're putting together plans for your network. And then this goes all the way to the customer experience. When you think about a billing relationship and how the money flows, who's going to be responsible for collecting that money and who is going to be responsible for handling everything from collecting the money to paying different vendors and different parties that are involved in the launch and operation of the network. Kind of think of this as a checklist for all the things a service provider has to think about. So in turn, I really think you should be thinking about as well. Next slide, please. And then finally, just a quick bit on Westminster, Maryland, which is a great public-private partnership that both the city and Ting are really excited about. Westminster is a town that is about, it's in between Baltimore and Washington, probably about a 30-minute drive from the Baltimore area. Population of just under 20,000. So a great example of a market that to many service providers is exciting. It is close to a couple of large metro areas and has a lot of commuters in it, and isn't necessarily the largest, nor does it really have to be. Ting is the network operator and a service provider on what is going to be an open network. And the arrangement here is attractive to someone like Ting because the city is building a fiber network where they're actually taking the installation of fiber to the lot of a home. So they're actually going from the curb to a premises, but then not inside or attaching to the premises. So Ting, as a network operator, really picks up the responsibility from just outside the premises to the outside of that premises and then all the way inside, as well as the customer experience. And so that's exciting to us because obviously the middle mile construction is it is quite an investment. It allows us to really focus on what we as a service provider think we do best, which is providing a great customer experience, selling and marketing. We've done a great job so far, I think, of working with the city to get the message out and make sure as many people as possible are excited about the gigabit network that is coming as this gets online. One thing about partnering with a service provider in general is they can really focus on some of the things that you as a municipality might not have a whole bunch of experience in, like high tempo sales and marketing, which a lot of service providers are used to. And then finally, shared risk and reward. I won't get too much into the specifics, but there's some equal footing there, like I mentioned in a previous slide, is very attractive to us when we're evaluating new markets. So next slide, and that's pretty much it. That's a brief overview of what we're up to, and yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Adam, what a wonderful presentation. Let me just ask a couple of quick questions before we go to our next panelist. I can go back to the last slide there for a moment. You highlight that you're a service provider, and yet you're building this open network within the city of Westminster, Maryland. Could you just speak a little bit to that? How do you think about the value to Ting as you are working to put an open network in place for the city?
Sure. Yeah, I kind of globbed a whole bunch of things together there at once. So we are the network operator in Westminster and are also charged with operating an open network for other service providers to come on board. And oddly enough, we have a lot of experience with that in our experience as a domain name registrar. So we actually operate a wholesale platform where 14,000 different service providers and web hosting companies currently use our platform and services to offer those services to their own customers. So that is something that's not new to us, but also something that we fundamentally believe in. And to be quite honest with you, I don't think we have seen any great execution of that idea so far in this space. And I think it is something that in other spaces we've done well, and we've also been able to see what some of the challenges are here. And so I think that is, not to toot our own horn a bit, but I think we plan to leverage that experience and what we've seen in those challenges to do a good job here.
No, I think you're really hitting on something important, and one of the most exciting things about the current interest in gigabit networks, I think Next Century Cities, and we have Deb Socia of Next Century Cities on our webinars one of the early weeks, is that the public-private model is still being defined as we speak, and there's a lot of attraction to that because it can take advantage of the open networks, as you've spoken about, but also bring the experience of a private provider. One more quick question on this is the shared risk and reward that you highlight here. Could you just quantify that a little bit more? How do you see the risk-reward calculus between the city, Westminster, and you as the service provider? Sure.
So, we totally understand that in order to get, if a municipality is going to make the significant investment to build a gigabit network in their town, that is going to be extremely capital intensive, and there's a lot of pressure there on the municipality to make sure that that money is spent wisely and that there's a return on that. I would say there's a spectrum in terms of expectations when it comes to different municipalities thinking of how much of that investment risk they want to download to service providers. What I'm basically getting at there is to say when we get spun up in a market, in Westminster or otherwise, it's going to take a lot of initial cash on our even if a city is building all the way to the curb and attaching to a home, in terms of setting up install staff, marketing, sales, all of that stuff, it's quite capital intensive. So to then layer on the expectation that a service provider is paying a large fees up front to get in the game is difficult. So when it comes to balancing that risk and reward, obviously we want, we're in it for the long haul in any of these markets, but we want to make sure that a city is also assuming some of that risk as opposed to downloading it all to a service provider, so we can work together to make sure it works.
Good, good. Well, great. I think this is a great setup for our final speaker of this webinar and of the series here. Before we have a little bit more discussion, again, please remember, put your questions forward in the queue. We will now turn to Steve Johnson, who will speak about tax-exempt financing. He's the principal and founder of SJ Advisors, based in the Minneapolis, Minnesota area. So welcome, Steve.
Well, thanks very much, Drew, Dave, and Meredith. And I'm delighted to participate in the webinar. It's a very exciting area to be focused on. And I'm sure we're going to see a lot of great things happening over the next few years, as we're already seeing now.
Please try to speak as close as possible to your microphone there, Steve, okay, so we can hear you clearly.
Okay, thanks for that feedback. Is this better?
That is a little better, yes.
A little better, okay, hold on. Okay, how's that?
Still better.
Better?
Yeah.
Still better?
That's better.
Okay, well, please, okay, great. Yeah, please interrupt me if I drop out. And
great.
So I was just saying that, yeah, I'm very, very pleased to be on the webinar, and it's a very exciting area. Thanks to you, Dave, Drew, and Meredith, and great job to the previous speakers. And so with all this opportunity out there, of course, there has to be a way to pay for it. There are many ways to do that. In this presentation, we're going to just scratch the surface on how tax-exempt financing may be useful in achieving these goals. And so if you could switch over to the next slide. Their tax-exempt securities are just one of the options, along with...
getting dimmer.
Well,
sound is getting dimmer there.
Okay, hold on a minute. I'm going to try just taking my headset off. Okay, how is this?
Much better, much better.
Much better. Okay, maybe the battery is going dead on that. Sorry about that, everybody. Okay, so let's just start over on this slide 2. There are really just big picture, 3 big buckets for funding project: your own cash, bringing in an equity investor, or using debt. I suppose grants and gifts could be added to this as well. We're going to focus on debt, and really the primary vehicle for state and local governments and 501c3 organizations is tax-exempt bonds. Along with that, taxable bonds are also often used for projects or components of projects that are not eligible for tax-exempt financing. And there are additional forms of debt like anticipation notes for short-term borrowings, various other loans and lines of credit that can be used in conjunction with the bonds. And oftentimes, additional debt-related products are used, such as swaps, letters of credit, that are added to modify the risk and or credit profile of the borrowing, of the financing. Let's go over to slide 3 now. There are quite a few different types of tax-exempt bonds. They can be categorized in a number of ways, and in this slide we're looking at a categorization based on security and source of repayment, and they can vary substantially in terms of the credit quality and therefore risk to investors, and that's important because that'll have an impact on the rate that you, the borrowers, have to pay. And there are 2 general categories. There are tax-backed, which can be utilized by state and local governments, and revenue bonds, which can be used by state and local governments as well as 501c3 organizations. And then which type is best for your project really is going to depend on quite a few factors. Of course, the type of entity, but also more nuanced is going to be the business model that you have for your project. And so because of all the variation and the possibilities, it's really important to get a financing team on board, at least the beginnings of a financing team on board in your project fairly early, to help explore and discuss some of these possibilities. You know, there could be anything from the creation of a special authority or agency, or working through an existing development agency or redevelopment agency, to some kind of public-private partnership that will influence the type of bonds and therefore the cost of those bonds. And so let's go to the next slide. And I just want to back up a little bit to give the big picture of the municipal bond market. And that first chart just shows that over the last 10 years, on average, $380 billion in bonds per year has been issued. So it's a sizable market. And if you look at the chart to the right, about 60% of those bonds have been issued by local governments and their authorities, which is probably the most likely category that financing these projects would fit into. Let's go to the next slide. And if we're to look at the types of entities, again, we broke those up into 2 categories: governmental and 501c3 organizations. And over the last couple of decades, really, there's been a sizable growth in the number of special districts that have been created for the issuance of tax-exempt bonds that serve multiple localities or multiple governmental entities. And that's probably a big potential opportunity for this type of project. We've already really touched on the types of bonds and notes that those entities can issue. The other big category, of course, 501c3 organizations. And it's interesting to note that in some cases,
a project, a network in this case, could be initiated by a private developer, but then a 501c3 organization could be created for a number of reasons, one of which would be for the issuance of tax-exempt bonds. And again, we're not going to get into the details of that now, but it's an interesting topic and has some potential. So let's go to slide 6. There are limitations to the types of projects that can be financed with tax-exempt bonds. Excuse me. But primarily, capital projects are the biggest purpose. And in addition, of course, refinancing existing debt, whether that be tax-exempt or taxable, is another big area. And I would just note that if there's an organization out there that has existing debt, they're contemplating a project like this, refinancing their existing debt to improve the rate and terms is oftentimes a key step to set the stage for new projects. Another category is reimbursement for if the organization has spent its own funds, it can reimburse itself by issuing tax-exempt bonds, and then also working capital to a very limited degree, and the cost of financing can be funded. Areas that are typically not eligible are, and here's a tricky area, but projects that are owned or controlled by a for-profit entity cannot be. Now there are limitations there, but also opportunities, and it's important to talk to the financing team and the attorneys to get clear on where the line is for financing projects that are owned or controlled by a for-profit entity. There are also some limitations around, excuse me, around refinancing and reimbursement. I won't get into those details right now, but again, it's good to have the team involved early in these conversations. And then lastly, working capital, that's in both columns. Again, there are severe limitations on financing working capital. So when these projects are getting kicked off, oftentimes funds are very limited for the ongoing operation. And so just keep in mind that if you're raising funds for the ongoing operations of the organization during the early years, that probably won't be tax-exempt financing. Again, that's where we often see a combination of sources of funding. And then the last point on this slide is that there are some additional significant constraints with respect to management contracts, and for those, the structure of compensation is very critical. Again, conversations with your counsel will help you avoid any problems or pitfalls there. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And I'm just going to cover this at a very high level. If you look back over the last dozen years or so, tax-exempt financing has been, on average, about 1% less expensive than taxable financing. And if we just run through a quick example, on a $25 million financing, clearly that would save about $250,000 in the first year, and the present value savings over 30-year amortizing financing would be roughly $3 million. And so significant savings are available through the use of tax-exempt financing versus taxable. Why don't we skip over to slide 8. So the timeline for these projects varies greatly. Likewise, the timeline for the financing of these projects can vary greatly. And it can be anywhere from literally a few months when everything is in order, ready to go, to several years. And it makes sense to break that up into 3 primary components. There's the planning stage, execution, and then something we call post-issuance compliance. And this chart sort of indicates the density of activity. So during the execution phase, there's a lot of activity from the financing team. A little less so during the planning stages, and then quite a bit less after the bonds are issued. But there still is some activity required to maintain the tax-exempt status of those bonds. It's important to note that structuring a financing is not a one-size-fits-all endeavor, and so especially for a segment like this that's up and coming with a lot of new opportunities to explore. And so again, getting the financing team on board relatively early is critical. Okay, let's look at slide 9. So we've talked quite a bit about the teams. Dave did a really nice job of showing in his slide that there are a number of teams that need to come together to make a project like this successful. And the financing team varies considerably depending on the type of entity, the type of bonds that are issued, et cetera. A couple of the key players, though, on the team, for any tax-exempt financing, there will be a bond counsel. They provide an opinion that the bonds do have a tax-exempt status. They also make sure that the state and local laws are being complied with or conformed to, and put together certain of the bond documents. The next key player is the issuers or borrowers counsel, and in some cases, in our experience, we've seen an inside counsel or a city counsel take this role, and it can work, though it's really a specialty area, and having a qualified firm is really critical. And so, I know Kirton McConkie and a number of others have high degree of expertise and specialization that would lend itself to filling this role. The financial advisor should be a firm that is registered as a municipal advisor, and that role prepares a variety of financial analysis and helps to structure the deal itself. And then there are quite a few other players, and again, the makeup depends on factors such as the type of bonds that are being issued, so particulars of the financing. All right, and that pretty much wraps it up. Slide 10, the next slide just touches on a key point. Over the last year, there have been some significant changes in the regulatory environment, and so any organization or entity or advisor that is providing advice on the structure, the timing, or the terms of a municipal security, then is actually deemed a municipal advisor by the SEC and MSRB. And so if they are providing advice along those lines, then they need to be registered with the SEC and MSRB. SJ Advisors is registered and can fill that role. And so that wraps up my part of the presentation. Drew and Dave.
Great. Wonderful, and thank you very much, Steve. One question occurred to me for you in particular that came through, and it concerns, this is a question about, questioner says, broadband bonding is not allowable by New Hampshire state law, tax exempt or not, and the incumbents lobby significantly to make this case. What creative funding opportunities are helping communities that cannot bond for broadband? Could you speak about that, New Hampshire or not, but just generally about the issue of how to confront, some of the limitations on bonding that you've also laid out here, Steve?
So now, I'm not familiar with that particular law in New Hampshire, and so that might be a case where they wouldn't be able to use tax-exempt financing, but would have to use taxable financing. And it may also be a situation in which counsel could be brought in to help with the legislation of new laws or changes to those existing laws.
I'm sure David will maybe supplement what I'm about to say, but it's almost like there's two classes of restrictions one will have to look at. One is substantive restrictions on telecommunications activity, and of course we're very familiar with those, and we've worked in states that have so-called restrictions. I mean, they are real restrictions, but there are ways to structure your entity to manage those. Now, how about restrictions on financing?
Yeah, excellent question, and I'll encourage you to go back to our first week webinar series where we talked a little bit about legality and financeability. But to drill down a little bit further on the New Hampshire question, I too am not uniquely familiar with the New Hampshire law. However, we have faced very restrictive laws in many states and have found ways to structure around them. For example, we're working in a state right now where there's a constitutional debt limitation that basically says for a municipality to finance the project, it has to go to a vote of the people. Well, this particular municipality doesn't want to put it on the ballot because then they can't educate the populace. So they've been looking for ways around that. And the use of a nonprofit economic development corporation may help get them there, something akin to what Lev has done in Cleveland. And so by using the EDC as the owner of the project and the municipality is the lessee of the project, then it may become financeable in its own right, not through the municipality, but through the Economic Development Corporation. And so with a little bit of creative thinking outside the box, we can get to the end game of being able to finance the project. That said, it's important that whoever you have on your team, whether it's your financial advisor, your bond counsel, your technology team, your management team, it's important that all of them get together on the same page toward the same goal and not have some of the friction that sometimes occurs when trying to protect one's turf. And so what I would suggest is that Ting's approach, for example, from a service provider perspective, to clear delineation of roles and responsibilities up front is critical. And I certainly applaud the efforts that they are making as they splash into this problem.
Well, and that's actually a great segue. I'd love to get Ting's response to this particular question, but also let me add on here. There's been a question raised about when you have this kind of project in a city where the city cable provider already has a significant fiber infrastructure and both AT&T and Verizon are pushing to gain market share, how do you deal with incumbents? Are they partners, advocates, or adversaries? And Adam, perhaps you have some thoughts on that you could share to this general question we're talking about.
Sorry, just took a sec to unmute. Yeah, sure. So when it comes to the incumbents question, I don't think we really have any strong feelings, any which way. To be quite honest with you, we have kind of looked at what the incumbents are doing as just an opportunity that doesn't take much work. They're just in the way that they, especially with smaller municipalities where they're not generally invested and they have so many battles to fight in other areas, I don't know, they're there but they're not there, if that makes sense. And so we still come to expect in a lot of these markets that we're looking at that those incumbents will eventually really focus on those markets, and we kind of welcome that. I mean, we're sort of used to it in the mobile space. We also come from a universe where margins in, say, internet services are much thinner, and so the oxygen in the fixed internet space is much more plentiful. One thing that I would sort of add when we were talking about creative ways to approach financing is what's really been striking with Westminster is how progressive a model they've come up with, given how new to the space most of the city administrators are. So what I mean by that is, just having a group of team members that aren't necessarily well versed in the intricacies of broadband and fiber hasn't really turned out to be much of a detriment, and in fact might have helped the city with their thinking in a way, because although this whole space is new, relatively speaking, Westminster really had a complete set of fresh eyes on it. And so I actually think that has helped them in the long run.
Lev, would you like to add anything about this particular point? I mean, I think that entities that want to build networks can view existing entrants as adversaries or partners, or ignore them completely. What's been your reaction, your circumstance in Northeast Ohio as you built that one community?
Yeah, the short answer is that it's a bit of co-opetition. That's just a lived reality. We are each other's pretty good customers. That is to say, we do business with the incumbents and they do business with us. It's really about providing the customer with the best solution that they're interested in. Obviously, our margins are impacted, but so too is our CapEx. So we're prudent with trying to get the balance sorted out. And the truth is, depending again on the specifics of your geography, your cable company may well be both a competitor to your efforts, but may also prove to be a very important partner, certainly a bridge partner as you move from launching your initiative to finishing your initiative, which can be a long journey. And at the same time, you want to provide services to people, and there are wholesale service options with certainly with the cable companies. That is to say, you can actually provide service to your customer using their infrastructure because you create a wholesale relationship with them.
Great, thank you. We've had a lot of questions and we've been answering them on the chat window. It might be worth highlighting just one or two of these as we gear towards conclusion. Are there smaller things that cities can do to help move gigabit networks along? Policies to include conduit under streets as construction projects are developed? Well, absolutely. Cohesive rights-of-way conduit, coal access strategies are important, and really, to me, an emphasis on why the city needs to be involved in some capacity in these networks to be able to specify the importance of having access and including the open access model for rights-of-way. These are the types of things that are vital, and to build them in place, cities need to be able to look to examples where they have happened. David, do you want to address that or other points here?
Yeah, it's a good point. Although I would be very cautious about how you go about those policies and protocols, because it's laden with quagmires of law and regulation. So if you're not careful, you may find yourself in the middle of a lawsuit that you didn't anticipate because of the way you structured those sorts of policies. So just be careful there and be very thoughtful and methodical as you go about implementing those policies. I'm not suggesting you don't do it. I'm simply saying that you need to be careful in the method by which you do.
What are some of the best practices, Dave, that we've seen in rights-of-way policy?
Yeah, it's really a question of openness. And so anytime a municipality tries to exact conduit from a provider and not make it open to people, or simply just exact it as a condition of getting right-of-way access, that is where you begin to, I guess, tiptoe into the realm of the Federal Telecommunications Act, which may get you in trouble.
Well, and we have had some questions, not only on this webinar, but previous ones, about the action by the FCC, the planned action on February 26th that will give Wilson, North Carolina, and Chattanooga, Tennessee, the relief they sought from restrictive rules those cities have imposed. The argument the FCC is preparing to make is that once states allow a particular amount of municipal broadband competition, that they can't unduly burden it.
Yeah, and maybe just to get on my last-ditch soapbox for a minute, relative to the history of all of this, it's interesting that the history of the Internet was that it was developed as a federal defense communications network that was then allowed to be commercialized to our great benefit. But now the argument has turned on its head to say, well, it's not fair for government to compete with the private sector on something that the private sector never was intended to have in the very first place, but has spent a lot of time and effort developing. And so we need to find ways to build policies, to build networks that recognize both the investment by the private sector and the need for infrastructure of the public sector without sort of pitting one against the other.
Great. Well, we are at our closing time. Let's just invite each of our three panelists, if they care to say a 20 or 30-second closing remarks, and we'll go in the order that we've had them. Lev, anything you'd like to add in conclusion?
No, just to encourage people, if they have questions, obviously to contact you two. If there are any specific questions related to one community, my Twitter handle is lgonic, or just lev.gonic@onecommunity.org, and thanks for the opportunity to spend an hour with you.
Thank you, Lev. Appreciate your eagerness and all the great work One Community is doing. Adam, would you like to say anything and wrap up?
Sure. Again, thanks again for the opportunity. I really enjoy doing this, and anybody that is planning to think about service providers in general, I'm happy to answer any questions of any nature around helping you with that thinking. Adam@ting.com.
Very good. Steve Johnson.
Yeah, and likewise, if you're contemplating a financing or possibly refinancing to get your balance sheet in order, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Great. And from us, I want to remind everyone that the video of this webinar, as well as others in the series, together with all of the PowerPoint presentations, is available at Kirton McConkie's website, which is kmclaw.com. From the front page, you can find a link to all of these materials. Also want to remind our viewers that the Broadband Communities Summit in April is an important point for many of these issues and topics to be addressed. Both David Shaw and myself will be at the event. David's actually participating in a panel with Lev Gonic, a program on Tuesday on financing fiber networks, and I'll be participating in a panel I'm sorry, David and Lev's is on Monday at the Broadband Community Summit, and my panel is on Tuesday, Connecting Communities Across Rural America with Ann Neville of the State Broadband Initiative. So look for that Broadband Community Summit. We had Masha Zager in one of our early panels, and appreciate the role that she played, as well, of course, as all of our panelists. Please give our thanks to Lev, to Adam, and to Steve, and feel free to contact David Shaw, dshaw@kmclaw.com, or myself, Drew Clark at kmclaw.com, with additional questions. Thank you again, and we will conclude the webinar now.